Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alex Baven, and I manage the Select Lincolnshire Food and Drink membership at the Lincolnshire Chamber of Commerce. Just want to give you a little bit of background to Select. We're a non-for-profit membership organisation passionate about providing its members with the help, support and guidance they need. Through the membership platform, we want to be a source of information and knowledge. We aim to support businesses with their growth, helping them develop existing markets and supporting access to new markets while raising the unique profile that we have of Lincolnshire produce locally, nationally and internationally. Absolutely delighted to welcome our panel of speakers today to share their expertise in managing that crisis. Joe Peck, Development Lead at Marsh Commercial, who will focus on the topic from an insurance perspective when faced with a product recall. Hannah Lee's partner at Roythorn Solicitors, who will look at it from a legal perspective and the implications for food producers when looking at that detailed world of regulations. And finally, Liz Cartwright, Managing Director from Cartwright Communications, who will look at it from a reputational perspective, especially what to do and what not to do in the times of a crisis. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. Can I ask that you keep your microphones on mute? There will be an opportunity to ask questions, and please feel free to use the chat facility as I was been monitoring that throughout. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you following the event, and we'll also share it on our website. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Joe.
Perfect. Now I'm going to hope that that's worked, but if someone can give me a thumbs up, that'd be great. Excellent. Well, look, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thank you, Alex, for the invite. It's an interesting topic and hopefully something we can get a lot out of today. Various things we're going to be talking about. You'll notice we're with Hannah and Liz, so I'll be staying firmly in my lane. I'm not going to talk about anything legal, anything regulatory, and certainly I'm staying away from PR and strategic comms. They're far better than me to talk about it, and I'd be far too worried about saying something wrong and embarrassing myself in front of them. By way of a short introduction, my name's Joe. I'm one of the development leaders at Marsh Commercial in Lincoln. We help business leaders throughout the East Midlands identify, manage, and, if appropriate, transfer risks through the purchase of insurance. The reason I explain it that way is because if I tell people I'm an insurance broker, they usually walk away. Specialist insurance for product recall does exist, but I'm not going to talk too much today about the specifics of insurance policies because that's really dull and we've got better ways of spending our time. So what are we going to go over? Well, look, I'll take you through a short introduction to a product recall and also the industries most commonly affected by them. Then we'll talk about the key considerations, and I've got a real life example. I know Hannah's got a case study as well. So there should be something that hopefully resonates with everybody. And then finally, I've compiled just 4 steps that we'd recommend to any business who is considering how they can minimize their chances of a loss. Okay, so a product recall. Well, it happens when a manufacturer or a producer becomes aware of a safety issue in their product and requests it to be returned from the consumer or removed from the shelves. Now, this safety issue could be real in that it has already or is very likely to cause the consumer illness or injury, or the issue could be threatened or alleged by a member of the public. Now, when a safety issue is discovered, it kicks off a series of events leading up to the recall itself. The manufacturer or the producer will have an obligation to notify their regulator immediately. And in most cases, they'll then have to notify the general public, including their customers, their suppliers, and any other stakeholders. At the same time as doing all that, the manufacturer or producer will be responsible for identifying and quarantining the affected products, determining the cause of the safety issue and where it came from. Was it a faulty or defective component, an incorrect raw ingredient, or mislabeling? And then they need to establish how long the issue has been present. This could require a site inspection, possible shutdowns, and very likely some sort of independent testing by a regulator or a third party. Logistically, executing the recall can be costly and complex in addition to addressing the underlying issues. In some cases, recalling the defective item may suffice, but in most, the business will then have to invest time and money into replacing ingredients or repairing parts, identifying new suppliers, or even bringing in temporary contractors. Often, the most challenging thing that we see And also the most expensive part is keeping the business operational whilst facing that public and regulatory scrutiny. For some businesses, a product recall can present a true business crisis. Managing a recall event carefully and quickly is critical to limiting the impact to consumers as well as the manufacturer's own business. So here are some of the key areas of business where we see product recalls most often. So when it comes to the food and beverage industry, it can be a variety of things, but the kind of keys that we see most often is meat-free products that contain traces of meat, or the meat is not the meat listed in the ingredients. I'm sure you can think of a recent scandal involving horse meat. Free-from products is another, where there's traces of wheat, gluten, egg, or other allergens that need to be notified, but aren't contained on the ingredients. And then the other that sometimes people miss is food recalled on religious grounds. So if it's a meat product, you can see you must have halal or kosher meat. Well, if it isn't, then that can lead to a recall as well. Because of the nature of the food and drink industry, there's really tight timescales in which to operate a product recall. That's obviously because of the shelf life of those products. Now, the automotive industry, these are relatively common, certainly higher than average, but actually they're typically less severe than the high-profile examples you might have seen. And they often involve manufacturing recalling a part following the discovery of a faulty or an underperforming part component. The ones that we see that are really high profile is where there's some safety critical element which is malfunctioning or not up to standard. So seat belts and airbags are the two you see most commonly. But in reality, any manufacturer or producer could find themselves subject to a product recall, especially if those products involve electricity or moving parts. They're inherently more dangerous, and if they have that fault, it is likely to be recalled. If you've ever been to Argos, or last time or next time you're in there, there's a list of products that are being recalled on a notice board next to the till. So you can see the kind of things that are being recalled there. Now, the kind of three key considerations of a product recall is first to identify the issue. We've talked a little bit about that. We'll need to get internal, maybe third-party testing is going to need to happen. You may need to employ experts, consultants to come and find that problem. Whilst they're doing that, you may need to close facilities, suspend production or reduce production, or possibly subcontract that production. Then, when you found an issue, you may need the cleaning, fixing, or replacing of the equipment in the production process. The next element is actually conducting the recall itself. So the first thing you'll be requested to do or required to do is issue a notice to consumers. Using channels that are available, you need to get that out to your consumer base. You then need to transport, store, destroy, dispose of all the affected products. So anything that's not working, you need to make sure it's not going to get into the public sphere again. You may need to replace ingredients or materials or products to kind of recommence the production process. And all of that takes time, and there may be overtime for employees that hasn't been factored into general budgeting. So those are all kind of additional considerations. With regards to that business continuity, you're going to be affected by loss of sales or customers. You may find cancelled contracts. You may need to replace suppliers or hire contract manufacturers, and there could be a prolonged interruption of production. So all of those things are going to affect your ability to make and sell. Additionally to that, there's also stalled research and development, merger acquisitions can all be impacted by a product recall event. So these are all the ways that we've found that businesses are affected. Now, there are a couple of others that I put in bold there, which I'm not going to touch upon today, but I know are going to be talked about. And that's government actions and actions from regulators, and also the impact of brand and reputational damage, I'm sure will be touched on a little bit later. So look, I'll take you through a nearly true story. We've changed a few of the key details because we don't want anyone to know exactly who it is. But I can tell you that this company did purchase insurance to protect themselves against this event. So they're still trading today. It's something we call the plight of the peanuts. So this company was a protein bar company, and they've been producing various flavors of its signature baked bars over the last 5 years. With market demand ever increasing and a strong social media presence, its annual revenue was around 25 million quid, with a further 50% growth forecasted for the next 12 months. While the protein bar products carry their own design, the company actually utilizes multiple facilities of its co-manufacturing partner to manufacture its products. So it's outsourcing most of the actual production. This is because the co-manufacturer is much, much bigger. They have scale, so they can actually buy at better prices, and it helps our company, the protein bar company, with their ambitious growth targets. The main selling point of these protein bars is that they don't use peanut, nut-based proteins. So that's a really key point when the co-manufacturer was chosen to do the manufacturing. Now, the protein bar company was notified by this co-manufacturer that the protein powder it had sourced from a third external supplier was found to have traces of peanuts. I'm sure you can see that coming. And 5 days of production had been affected. So immediately, the FSA, the Food Standard Agency, were notified, and an urgent recall notice was issued on all 6 product lines of the company's baked bars until this common ingredient could be we could find it, isolate it, and then change it over. Now, because of this company's really strong social media presence, the news spread super quickly. The fallout was absolutely catastrophic for this company, with most of the company's sales being direct to the consumer. The first public notification on the company website and social media channels incited pretty overwhelming negative comments from their customers. Comments on social media even spiraled out of control as influencers used their platforms to express anger and disappointment. The situation worsened when the company re-entered into contract renewal talks with the retailers they currently traded with, as well as potential new contracts. One of the reasons the company was forecasting such a strong growth was that it had entered into initial discussions with major retailers to sell their products in store, all of which have been really positive up until this point. Unfortunately, these final stage talks fell apart as the news of this recent recall continued to spread. Coupled with the declining sales, the company began to feel the pinch. Ultimately, none of the new contracts were signed as the retailers didn't want to take the risk, and the forecasted growth of £12.5 million completely disappeared, while the company was still struggling to stay afloat. Now, in addition to the lost sales, it was about £700,000 worth of unconsumed, recalled products that went to waste. There was about £50,000 in overtime costs. Now, this is sounding pretty catastrophic, and that's fair because it is. But ultimately, this whole story accumulated in an £11.5 million loss from the loss itself, the overtime, the actions that required taking, and the consequential loss of the £12.5 million forecasted growth. Now, you might think, and it's fair to say, that you should have rights of recourse against your manufacturing supply chain. In this instance, the contract that was in place, but it was limited to £1 million for consequential losses as a result of a product recall event. So the £11.5 million was hit on the company's bottom line. Now, before everyone gets too upset, this company was insured, and I'm very pleased to say that they are still trading. They were recouped for their loss, and it's a real success story for the insurance industry. We don't have many, but we do things right sometimes. The last thing I just wanted to touch upon before I think I had to hand over to either to Hannah or back to Alex is a few practical things that you could actually take away from today if it's something you're considering within your business. So the first is just a comprehensive supplier approval process. So with products only being as good as their worst ingredient, weakest link, and so on, the supply chain management is a really crucial step in your quality assurance process. Make sure you have a comprehensive supplier approval process in place that demonstrates really good oversight and control, and make sure it's documented and reviewed regularly. That's going to be absolutely key. Secondly, is just the testing procedures. There's a lot. It's the spine of a quality assurance regime, and they demonstrate essential checks during the production process. You may have metal detectors or other bits within your actual manufacturing line where you can find stock that's substandard. So make sure you're assessing that. When you're working with a co-manufacturer, again, it's a lot like the first one. Is let's just make sure you've got a really good oversight of what that company does, how they do it, and be consistent in reviewing your relationships with those co-manufacturers. Hannah maybe may go into it, probably possibly not for today, but your contracts with those manufacturers is going to be absolutely key. So make sure you get professional help with making those contracts. And finally, a really well-prepared business is one step closer to preventing a crisis. So make sure you have a management plan. Take some time to consider a recall and crisis management plan. And then with all business continuity and with recall plans especially, do a tabletop exercise. Who is the first phone call going to? How is this going to affect the business? And really test your preparedness. So with those four things, hopefully you'll be one step closer to having a good, resilient business. And with that, thank you for your time, and I'll hand back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was really interesting. And one question I've got is, from a smaller producer perspective, it's those batch numbers in terms of being able to trace back actually when you did that, that product, when it was produced. So being able to quickly know what lines, or when it was produced, isn't it? And absolutely. So knowing what's coming in, what's going out, it's equally important. So you need to track it in and out as it comes in and out of your factory. So yeah, for sure. Yeah, really interesting. Well, thank you very much. Now hand over to Hannah and to look at the sort of regulatory things that we need to consider.
That's great, thank you. Hopefully I will be able to share my screen. Hopefully that has worked.
Yes, all good.
Brilliant. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Hannah Lees and I'm a partner at Roy Thorne's Solicitors, and I head up the food regulatory team there. I spend my days challenging overzealous enforcement action by regulators such as the Food Standards Agency, DEFRA and local councils. And my work does include assisting clients where there's been a potential food or feed safety issue that's arisen and a withdrawal of products from the market is required. In the preparation for today, I had a look at the Food Standards Agency website last week, actually, to have a look at how many recalls there actually are. And between the 6th of November 2017 and the 16th of September 2021, there were 642 recalls. And by my very rough and ready calculation, and I took that to be about 4 years, we're looking at a recall around every 2.5 days. So this is a massive problem across the industry. It's affecting a lot of people. Lots and lots of reasons for recalls to happen. I would estimate that around half of them relate to a failure to put an allergen on a label. That seemed to come up time and time again. But there were lots of other reasons for recalls, a risk of salmonella, presence of foreign bodies in the food like plastic or glass or metal. And there was even one not too long ago which gave rise to a choking hazard because an unpermitted chemical had been used. So there's all sorts of reasons for recalls. What I would like to run through today with you is the key legal obligations that you're subjected to. I then hopefully am going to explain to you the importance of compliance, and I'm going to give you some practical tips in terms of how to best comply. I've then got a case study, which hopefully you will find interesting. There's a few lessons we can learn from that case study. And then I've distilled everything down into 3 golden rules that you can take away with a view to best protecting your business. So a couple of preliminary points, and I'm sure you all know these already, but they're worth reiterating. And the food business operator is the natural or legal persons responsible for ensuring that the requirements of food law are met within the business under their control. And I would just draw your attention to responsible for ensuring, because the buck stops with you when you're a food business operator. You have to make sure that the food or feed you're producing is safe. And that burdensome obligation applies all the way through all stages of production, including processing and distribution. There are 3 key legal obligations that you're subjected to when we're talking about withdrawals and recalls of food from the market. So you have to operate according to the applicable food and feed safety regulations, so ensure that anything you're producing is safe. You must have a traceability system in place, and you must do all you can to ensure that unsafe feed or food is withdrawn from the market if that becomes necessary. So just rattling through these really quickly. The obligation to operate according to the law really speaks for itself. You are the one who has ultimate responsibility for ensuring that feed or food is safe, and so you must comply with the law. It's a very, very high burden. And I would say that even if you do comply with every applicable law, it will not necessarily mean that the feed or food you're producing is safe. And that's why it's really important that you do as much due diligence as you possibly can. So traceability, and a traceability system is defined in the regulations as the ability to trace and follow a food, feed, or food-producing animal or substance intended to be or expected to be incorporated into a food or feed through all stages of production, processing, and distribution. So we all know that traceability is a way for us to keep a track of the food in the supply chain, and it supports the accurate withdrawal or recall of an unsafe food or feed if that becomes necessary. And these traceability requirements are really the practical development of the farm to fork approach, and they've been around since the BSE crisis. And the BSE crisis alerted European regulators to the fact that there was a massive hole in the law and they needed to do something, whereby if an unsafe feed or food was identified, steps could be taken to ensure that that feed or food was quickly withdrawn from the market. So in terms of the specific obligations, and Joe touched on these a moment ago as well, if you have reason to believe that a feed or food that you have produced is unsafe, you must notify the competent authority. You must take measures to achieve that withdrawal without delay. You must tell consumers about the reasons for the withdrawal, and they may be asked to return products. And that responsibility extends to include retailers and distributors. Now, responsible businesses will know all about their supply chains. And the obligation under the law is to trace one up, one down. But many of the businesses that I deal with will do an awful lot more due diligence than that. And a real understanding of the whole supply chain is extremely important because it allows a holistic approach. There is a real risk to a business where a food or feed is found to be unsafe or harmful, or where it may be. And it's better to avoid that situation in the first place if you possibly can. Reputable suppliers will be happy to provide you with paperwork, with testing certificates, allow you to attend at their premises, inspect operations. And where suppliers are reluctant to let you do that, I would say that that ought to set alarm bells ringing for you. So whilst you might be able to get a suitable paper trail together, knowing who supplied you and where you're selling your product to in order to comply with the obligations under the law, that probably won't be enough to allow you to undertake a proper risk assessment. You need to understand where all of your ingredients are coming from, and really you need to know exactly where they've been sourced right from the beginning. The more information you keep, the easier and quicker it will be to identify an affected food, mitigate risk to consumers, and save yourselves a lot of time and money. And it's where you can make a real difference to your business. The ability to undertake a withdrawal or recall effectively and quickly will have a huge bearing on consumer confidence in your business and in your products. And any issue which results in the need for a withdrawal or recall of a food product from the market necessarily means that there has been some issue in relation to the safety of that product. And that unfortunately almost certainly means that the regulator will be coming after you wanting to take enforcement action. If you have taken every possible step you can to ensure that what you're doing is safe, and if something has gone wrong, you then take steps quickly and effectively to withdraw or recall that unsafe product from the market, then it's unlikely that the regulator is going to want to prosecute you. And even if they do prosecute you, somebody like me can step forward and put forward a due diligence defence on your behalf. Now, a due diligence defence is very, very difficult to put forward. You must show that you've taken all reasonable steps and exercised all due diligence. And what that really means is that you must have done absolutely anything and everything you can possibly think of to avoid this event ever having coming about. It's a very high burden. So the case study I want to take you through, I'm afraid I've had to be a little bit creative with the facts as well, because I can't disclose the details of the case because of confidentiality. But I've tried to keep all of the key points in because there's quite a few good lessons I think we can learn from this case. So this was a large animal feed company, and it was producing various different types of feed for different animals. And the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons alerted the Food Standards Agency to a possible connection between my client's feed and some disease in animals that they had been seeing. And the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons quite properly notified the Food Standards Agency about these findings. And that prompted the Food Standards Agency to request withdrawal of the potentially unsafe feed and food from the market, and a product recall was instigated. Sorry, forgot my slide. And as it says there, this was done at the behest of the regulator. And similarly, the retailers undertook a recall as well, so the people that we'd supplied with this product. And it's really important to outline at the beginning that this was taken as a purely precautionary measure. There was no evidence at all that our feed was unsafe. There was merely a potential link between my client's feed and this issue that was arising in animals. And this measure was taken by my client's company so that the Food Standards Agency could investigate and sample, etc., in order to ascertain what the cause was. So the initial testing that was undertaken at the behest of the FSA, according to the FSA, demonstrated a link between the feed and the disease that was being seen in animals. And the Food Standards Agency wanted to put an update out to the public that it was our feed that was causing this disease. And this is what led to my involvement. My client was not in any way satisfied that the testing demonstrated that. And in fact, the relevant evidence that was available at this time actually pointed away from it. So upon my instruction, we appointed our own independent expert, and he confirmed that the testing programme that had been undertaken at the behest of the FSA was totally lacking. There was no ability to draw any proper conclusions from the results of the sampling that they had undertaken, and there was certainly no basis upon which they could undertake any kind of a risk assessment. So our expert advised the FSA as to the appropriate testing and sampling regime that needed to be undertaken. And in fairness to the FSA, they took on board that advice and they agreed to that sampling and testing being undertaken. In addition to appointing that expert, the scientific expert, who was looking at the actual feed and whether there was anything wrong with it, we also appointed an epidemiological expert to review the evidence and data that the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons had supplied to the Food Standards Agency. And the epidemiological expert that we instructed suggested that there was some real issues with the data and evidence that had been collected. And just like with the other sampling that had been undertaken, it wasn't possible from that to draw any sort of link between my client's feed and the disease that was being seen in animals. So there's a question mark really over whether the FSA had enough to require a recall in the first place. So we undertook the more detailed sampling and testing that our independent expert had recommended, and lo and behold, it revealed that my client's feed company could not have been the cause of the disease in animals. And irrespective of that, the FSA then ran off and did another risk assessment, which again suggested that it was. And it then took additional work on both my part and our independent expert's part in getting the FSA to see sense. And I'm pleased to say that the FSA finally did agree that there was no evidence that there was a link between the feed and the disease. And they finally issued a public statement confirming that. But all of this took several months. So in between the date when the recall and withdrawal was initially instigated, I think it was around 2 to 3 months before the FSA actually reached that conclusion. And so the reputational damage that my client company suffered in the meantime was really catastrophic. I would say it's likely to be irreversible because even though we've been shown to be entirely vindicated, consumers and the public think there's no smoke without fire. Why would the Food Standards Agency be pointing the finger at your company if it hasn't done anything wrong? And there was an issue over some customers refusing to pay for products that they'd been supplied with, even products that were not part of the recall, just presumably because of a lack of confidence in the product. And there was also a dispute over who was going to pay for the cost of this recall, because in this example, my client was entirely vindicated and the recall had been actually unnecessary. But there was a question that gave rise to a question mark over who was going to pay for that. And there was also huge costs associated with the testing and sampling programme in order for us to demonstrate that our feed was safe. I think that each test cost £10,000 and we had to do tens and tens and tens of tests in order to demonstrate that the feed was safe. And the losses are easily into six figures and into the multi-millions of pounds. So in terms of the key lessons that I'd ask you to take away, the first is do your own due diligence. Know your supply chain, ask questions, satisfy yourselves that absolutely everything that's going into your feed or food are from reputable suppliers and they're safe. And try to be proactive, not reactive. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but it won't help you if you've got a food safety issue. Try to preempt those questions and really think about the risks now. Ask yourselves if there's anything else you could be doing to reduce any possible risk, and be critical of your systems and procedures, and continually think about your risk assessments and whether you could be doing anything else to reduce the risk. Also, I'd ask you to bear in mind emerging risks. I've read recently that there is a potential issue in relation to an increase in mycotoxins, for example. Now, I'm no scientist, so this may be actually quite off the mark, but my understanding is that there are over 5,000 mycotoxins that can occur. They can occur in cereals and potatoes, and because of climate change, the risk of mycotoxins in our food and feed is increasing because the warmer weather conditions promote the growth of those toxins. And nobody knows anything about them. These 5,000 mycotoxins that could be harmful to health, nobody really understands, because we've never had to before, because the levels were so low we didn't need to worry about it, but they're increasing. So that's one emerging risk that I'm aware of, but I'm sure there will be others that will affect your particular sectors. The second lesson I would ask you to take away is not to blindly follow the advice of the Food Standards Agency. And I think I've already said that I have the displeasure of dealing with the FSA on a day-to-day basis. And I can say with absolute certainty that there is a real lack of expertise within the FSA. And 9 times out of 10, they do get it wrong. Now, you're in an unenviable position because you have to cooperate with your regulator. You have to work with them every day. You've got to get on with them. But that doesn't mean that you have to just blindly follow what they're telling you to do. So even if you don't want to instruct the lawyers if something goes wrong, I would definitely recommend that you seek input from an independent expert who can tell you whether or not what the FSA is telling you to do is right. And in terms of regulators, I would also say that it's worthwhile keeping trading standards close. In my experience, they are helpful, practical, and knowledgeable. And if and when an issue like this arises, they very often will come out, take the time to get to know the business, and rather than wanting to prosecute you, which would be the FSA's primary goal, they would rather ensure that what you are doing is safe and think about the consumer. And so I would urge you to try to form a good relationship with trading standards if you can. And the final point is to try to ensure that you've got the right insurance cover in place. And just a couple of examples on files that I've had over the last couple of years where there's been a potential issue. The first one, again, was for a feed company, and the product recall parts of the policy related to food and set out sections of the Food Safety Act, and it didn't appear at first blush to actually even cover feed, which was a bit of a problem when we were producing feed. And another one is that you must bear in mind that food and feed law is entirely precautionary. So just like in my example I gave you a moment ago, that case study, we had to recall that feed because there was a potential risk that it was unsafe, but it actually transpired that it wasn't unsafe at all. And if you have an insurance policy in place that only pays out where there is an event of unsafety, so for example, if somebody dies within a certain period of time or somebody gets a disease within a certain period of time, then that won't help you in a situation where you've had to do a recall because of a risk of unsafety, but where the product actually turns out to be safe. So that was pretty much all I wanted to go through. I think there's time for questions at the end, isn't there? But if anybody's got a burning desire to ask me anything, then feel free.
Thank you, Hannah. It was really interesting from the cost, because that was going to be one of my questions in terms of who bears that cost. But obviously it's the producer, the manufacturer, that if they're unhappy with the FSA, then they take their own independent research and do their investigations. And they, unless they get a reply back from the FSA that they were in the wrong, that they have to pay for it all, which it must be, in terms of that cost that you weren't expecting, quite huge from what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. The cost of those tests were £10,000 a go, and we had to do a lot of them. And the FSA will never admit it's wrong, so you'd be very lucky to get any money out of them.
Gosh, that's quite a cost to bear, isn't it? Especially if you're a small producer as well, and the types of tests that you might need to do.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, thank you very much. That was really, really informative. No further ado, I'll hand you over to Liz, Liz Cartwright from Cartwright Communications, who's going to look at it from a PR and reputational perspective. Liz, if you'd like to take the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Hannah and Joe there were talking about some pretty scary crises that happened in those case studies there. I've also got some case studies today which have been anonymised too. that crisis communications is far more complex than it used to be, say 15 years, 20 years ago when I was in journalism, because we've got social media to think about. So this is quite a big topic, and I've tried to condense this as best I can today in terms of some advice and some tips, and also some examples. So first of all, a little bit about me. So I started my life at the Lincolnshire Echo many years ago, and have worked on regional and national titles since then. So having been on the other side and sort of tackling companies that have had these sorts of issues, I know very well how to deal with them from the other side. So sort of a bit, poacher turned gamekeeper type thing. So we have a lot of clients in the food and drink industry, and in agriculture as well. And we also work with external communications in crisis, but internal communications for large organisations is just as important, and that is often overlooked when dealing with a crisis, dealing with the media. People tend to overlook how important it is to communicate with your staff. So I'll just tell you, this is just a little bit about our services, but here today I'm here to talk to you about crisis. Here's some of our clients. So we've got some really big food and drink clients, but we've also got some smaller ones as well. And we help with them with all of their crisis comms, and we were very busy during the pandemic with COVID breakouts, that sort of thing. So these are the sorts of clients that we work with. So objectives today. I think that, I just want to be able to give you some advice and tips that you feel some confidence to be able to deal with the media if the media calls when you've had a crisis. So let me just I'm going to help you sort of learn to assess the potential threat to reputation, learn how to respond when things do go wrong. So the protein bar manufacturer that Joe talked about, they would need to sort of respond when, with their crisis communications strategy. And I think the important thing there is to learn how to showcase successes. So often when companies have had an issue and it's been played out in the media in a hostile way, as we call it, they sort of put their feet up and think that's it. But you actually really need to showcase successes and positive news after that. We also want you to understand the comparative roles of the social media and traditional media when crisis is escalating. And then I'm going to help you with some examples and help you just give you some tips on how to deal with it. So we all remember this gentleman when he did an ill-advised interview, completely the wrong time, and it put his story right back in the limelight. And well, how do we avoid that? And it was a really silly thing to do. And obviously his comms team weren't thinking clearly that day. When they agreed for him to go in front of an interview, he was ill prepared and had some very odd things to say and showed no real empathy. I'm sure you remember that. So how do we prepare when the media start ringing you to ask you about your crisis, what's happened in your factory, what's happened with that recall? It's very simple. You need to be prepared. You need to be as prepared as possible because no two media crises are the same. So you must have an action plan. So part of your full strategy for if something goes wrong, which would be sort of your business continuity plan, you need to have that element of a comm strategy in there when a crisis happens. So it's really important you have a plan. That plan, for example, will feature directors' out of hours numbers. It will feature your comms teams. It will make sure that you can, if something happens over a weekend, you are able to get hold of everybody within the senior team in order to be able to respond to a media request, for example. You quickly need to decide if you're going to give live interviews or statements. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. You need to liaise with your team and other organisations involved in this crisis. You know, we talked about there about the animal feed company, supply chain involved as well. So it's really important that you have a commonality between a common message between all of those organisations that are involved in that hostile media inquiry. If the topic is controversial, you have to be prepared that it's going to get awkward, and therefore you need to be putting up the best people for interview. That might not be your managing director or CEO. It might be somebody else within the team who is very familiar, and they would need to be media trained. Be concise when you're responding to the media. Stay composed. Decide on a central message and stick to it. Get your points across early. Don't commit to any actions that you can't follow up. So, for example, you don't want to be saying that you are after a story about staff redundancies. You then don't want to be talking about, but you know, you're only going to be making X redundant. If that is not the case, you have to be very, very clear about what your message is. So the comms process, a media inquiry comes in, you respond, and then there's coverage. Pretty simple. But what I wanted to talk about now is when that journalist calls. So the journalist is calling you, everybody panics, and therefore something very, very simple that I always like to remind clients, that call is going to come into a receptionist or administrator, and they also must be part of the crisis communications plan. I've known it with a couple of clients where a journalist has jumped on the receptionist on the phone and has asked them for information about a story, and she's very quickly responded. You must persuade your staff not to talk about a crisis incident until your plan is in place. You must advise them not to say anything to a journalist until you're ready to speak to them. So if you have a comms team, always seek the advice of the comms team first before you do anything. When a journalist calls, take a note of their name, their phone number, their deadline. The deadline is super important, because if you miss the deadline, then you're going to sort of run this risk of nobody was available at this company for a comment. You must stick to the deadline. And don't be tempted to speak off the cuff or off the record to a journalist. You must be prepared and you must be planned. Be speedy in your response. Be aware of the deadline. As I just say, you must stick to that deadline. And then immediately when that journalist calls, find out if it's an interview situation or a comment for a press release or statement that you're going to be providing. I try and advise clients wherever possible to do a statement. Again, when I was a journalist many years ago, we would always want somebody on the phone or in front of a camera for an interview. But we are able to provide statements a lot more easily now, thank goodness. And even radio, BBC Radio News will take statements as well. They don't like it, but it really helps control the organisation's message. But if you do agree to an interview, be prepared. Understand why the interview has been arranged. Why do they want to interview? What do you want to get? You can ask the journalist as much as you want in terms of why they want it. And when is it going to be used? When is it going to be aired? That type of thing. And of course, that is for TV and radio, although a lot more print titles now have that video functionality, and video is incredibly popular among all journalists, and particularly so during the pandemic and post-pandemic. Have your strategy ready to make sure that your interview is interesting and quotable. Consider potential questions and any curveballs that might come your way. Rehearse 3 key messages. So make sure that if you've got 3 things that you want to get across, and try and only keep it to 3, that you're being very concise, very clear about what those messages are. Personalize your message. Be empathetic. Talk about the people who support you, your dedicated staff, for example. Try and make it as personal as possible. Try and speak to journalists with confidence and to get the best from the interview. This is for hostile or non-hostile media. I would always advise you to take media training though. And as Alex alluded to earlier on, we've all had to adapt to new technology. And this one we all remember, Professor Robert Kelly, who had a rather embarrassing moment when his toddler ran in, followed by the nanny. When you're doing an interview, and a lot of interviews are still happening on Zoom, please make sure that the children are kept away, dogs, postmen are ignored, etc. Prepare the scene of the interview. And also, if you're doing a radio interview or a TV interview, please remember to turn off your microphone. As you remember, this is the lady who Gordon Brown called the bigoted woman, which the whole nation heard because he was still wearing his lapel mic. So, tackling a tricky question. So, when you're dealing with an interview on the radio or the telly, or even if you're giving an interview to a journalist over the phone or face to face, take the question in your stride. So if you're giving a difficult question, try and take charge of the situation. Don't say, I don't know, I can't answer. Try and say something which is a sort of a bridging technique, which is, I can help you with that in the future. Is something I need to look into. Try and use those bridging techniques. You don't have to answer the question, but just use the politician's technique of trying to take charge of the situation and lead it. If you don't know the answer to the question, explain why. And that might mean that you haven't got all of the information. Try not to tell fibs. You need to be very, very honest. If you need to give the journalist any more information that you weren't able to give them, then explain to the journalist that you can call them back with more information if appropriate. So this is a bit of a checklist, and I'm just going to whiz through this because I've got there's quite a lot here, I realise. But as I say, always act quickly, responsibly, stick to facts, have your notes to hand if you prefer, be assertive, authentic, have a clear focus and explain your plan of action, have bullet points of what you want to say, be empathetic and reassuring, do keep people informed internally, externally and socially. And as I said before, this is where large organisations tend to forget their internal teams. Say sorry if you need to. It isn't admitting liability. Say sorry if there's a human interest to the story. Don't speak off the record. Don't say something off the top of your head. Don't mislead or cover up, and don't ignore questions. Don't make it up. Yes, you would be surprised how many people do. And don't exit an interview before it's finished. We've seen those people sort of take off their microphones and storm out. And don't be defensive or obstructive. So these are the sorts of rights that you have when you enter an interview or you're starting to deal with a story which is non-hostile or hostile with a journalist. You have the right to know the topic in advance. You have time to answer the question when you're giving an interview to a broadcast journalist. You can correct misstatements. So if something is used in a print title that is not correct, you can have that corrected. It can be done, obviously, online, very difficult in print. You can have the right to use notes. You have the right to record the interview as well. However, you don't have the right to know the questions in advance, although over the last few years, I've noticed that a lot more journalists are doing that and enabling you to get prepared. So always ask if you can. You cannot see the story in advance or edit it. This is obviously a print title. Again, that has started to happen a little bit more. So sometimes we can ask, but it really rubs a journalist up the wrong way, and especially on those national titles. You can't change your quotes. What has been reported on that day is what it is. And you can't expect your view to be the only view. So journalism requires a balanced report. So as well as your comments within a story, they will be asking other organisations, such as HSE, for example, or even a member of the team. And you don't have a right to ask the article to be taken down. The new media landscape. So news now travels a lot faster. So my job as a PR person 15 years ago was a heck of a lot easier, because we just dealt very much with print titles. Now we have a 24-hour news culture, and social media means that everybody is a journalist or a troll. So citizen journalists are filling the gaps and driving the news gathering. So don't ignore social media. It's often the first warning sign that a crisis is about to hit as well. So make sure that your teams within your organisations are social listening. That means listening, looking and watching Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and making sure that you're keeping an eye on those comments. Social media does have an influence. Remember, it isn't just the media organisations which have the influence anymore. And those activists, those trolls on social media channels can be extremely damaging and extremely harmful, particularly to your internal staff who may be personally attacked on social media. And so the crisis is now far reaching. We're dealing with a large organisation, a leisure organisation at the moment, which is having a lot of issues with crisis, and so a lot of their internal staff have been attacked on social media, which is, we've had to involve the police, and it's a very, very difficult process. So social media strengths and perils. Just remember that anything that you do post is checked and double checked, and always be seen to be responding. So if there is a niggle on social media about a product that isn't up to scratch, you need to be responding, but encourage that person to take the grievances offline, so that you can either direct message them or take their grievance into an email. Don't engage with trolls. It's a very, very tempting thing to do. Ignore trolls. So trolls, for those who aren't aware, are people on social media who often don't have a lot of, who have a lot of time on their hands, who are there to make trouble, and we don't. It's just best not to engage. If you are particularly concerned about trolling, then it's one for the police, and for clients we have been engaging with police in the past, and a lot of the of the posts are considered to be harassment, and then they get involved, and they are excellent at supporting with this. Respond immediately. Don't respond immediately. Don't take too long to respond, because you need to be sort of being really, really on any social media posts, and don't post too frequently. So key learnings after a crisis. It's important to review your learnings. What happened? What did you do well? What didn't you do well? And you need to update your crisis comms section in your business continuity plan from the learnings that you made. So here's some things to think about. Best practice: did you follow every step of the crisis? If not, why not? And do you need to tweak your process? The coverage. Negative story is disappointing, but sometimes unavoidable. But were you able to add to the narrative and respond? And are you now able to respond in a positive way with some positive news stories? Oops, that one doesn't want to work. Sorry, that doesn't want to work. Oh, were you able to meet the journalist deadline? If not, can you streamline your crisis process to speed it up? And if you issue a statement, gave an interview and held a press conference, what worked best? So always have a look at those, at how you've responded in a crisis. So I'm just looking at the time. I've just got a few examples to take you through. So this is a real life situation. We had a fire breakout overnight at a factory. Thankfully, nobody was harmed, and the evacuation procedures kept everybody safe. and a journalist wanted to write a report about it. So we decided to keep the response very short and factual, providing the dates, times and high-level details of the crisis. We also involved the relevant emergency services that dealt, because the journalist often wants to speak to fire or police or ambulance, in fact, after, just to collaborate the story. A success, if possible, bring a positive to the situation, talk about your evacuation process and how it worked really well, and the return to normal operation very quickly. So this, for example, we've just sort of slightly tweaked this so it's anonymised. We can confirm that Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue attended a small fire that broke out in the roof void of our site yesterday. And this is a very, very simple 4-line statement, and that is all we needed to provide. We also tend to find that if you give your journalist an A4 sheet of comment, they're going to pick bits out that they want, and often that isn't what we want them to do. We don't want to pick out the bits that they think are interesting. We want to give them a balanced view of the incident. COVID crisis. So this was another real case study, an outbreak in a factory, and the employees actually contacted the press expressing their concerns about going to work. So again, we found out the situation and put together a statement, and we were able to say that we were dealing with it well, and that the incident has been isolated, and talking about how important the health, safety and well-being of the workforce was, and also wishing our staff a speedy recovery. So this is a very, very good statement that shows empathy, reassurance and action. Product recall, batch of products have reached the shelves that aren't up to the usual standards. So we again, action, concern and contact. So we provided the following short response. Obviously, this one requires phone number and any lot codes of the recalled products. And this was another pandemic one. This was for a large client down south. And basically, we had a senior member of staff who was accepting cash from customers and making the payments with her own card, despite a no cash rule. The employee was dismissed because she was doing this, but a journalist got hold of the story. And again, this is how we dealt with it. Short statement, again, showing action. We kept the response very short, and empathy, showing our human side. And I think that's it. And I'm sorry if I've gone over time, Alex.
No, it was all really interesting and very thought-provoking. I think with all of the presentations today, it's sort of fail to prepare to fail, isn't it, in terms of every aspect of looking at your business. I know with looking at the fire one, I remember reading an example of that where actually somebody had tweeted that an air ambulance had landed on, at the premises of a business, and so alerted, the press to that. I know that the fire brigade tweeted where they'd attended a fire. So often these instances are taken out of your hands before you even get a chance to respond, isn't it? It's already out there in the public domain. So yeah, so really interesting. I don't know if anyone has got any questions. Doesn't look like we've got anything at the moment. But I've just sort of fascinating in terms of that, and how you, I suppose, really look at your crisis communications, isn't it? Because many people do one and then it gets put on the shelf and never really gets properly tested. Obviously, it's probably been tested over the last 18 months where you've had to look at every different scenario for the business. But as you say, Liz, it's actually testing it, having a debrief, what worked, what didn't work, and running out scenarios and making sure that the key people in the team are media trained and putting them through that scrutiny, even if it's in a test scenario, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we've done with large organisations, not in the food and drink industry actually, but we've been part of their business continuity days where they practice for a crisis, so a fire, those sorts of things. And it's actually been, we've had role plays, we've had people pretending to be journalists on site. actually, it really tests your plans and it really tests your crisis comms strategy. I think that the addition of social media now is really difficult. It's really difficult to control. But in the case of some of those case studies there, and particularly the last one, we had a lot of negative. We had a lot of trolling, and trolling is a really upsetting thing for your internal teams, because they are, in the case of the client we're dealing with at the moment, they are sort of easily finding people's personal Twitters and Instagrams and targeting individuals who aren't even involved in the crisis, and it's really, really difficult to control. But always contact the police when that happens.
Yes, as you say, it becomes very personal and easily to respond. I think that's the thing with social media now. You think you can just respond to that one person, but it's not. It's a sort of the reputational damage for the business and the ongoing effects, isn't it? Jodie's just put in, from Lincolnshire Honey's just put in a question to Jo, actually. Sort of what insurances would you advise to have in place? Probably quite a large question for you, but I suppose it's finding the right one, but I'll leave you to. Yeah,
it's a massive question. There are product recall policies that react specifically to a product recall event. I suppose the only thing I could offer in terms of some intelligence on that is most businesses will be aware of their product liability. Now that reacts when a product has already caused injury or harm, so it reacts to that, but it won't cover things like the recall procedure, it won't cover the reputational damage. That all needs to be specifically considered and bought. And the same with elements like cyber and extortion. So all of those are additional considerations into what you might consider a typical insurance policy. I'm sorry if that feels like a bit of a cop-out, but it's such a broad question. It would be very difficult to identify, because the other thing, it will differ per business. It will differ per a risk attitude. Some people are willing to accept risk. Some people want to mitigate against everything they possibly can. And beyond that, there's the cost. It's an incredibly complex question. I'm afraid I really can't give a better answer than that at this stage.
No, that's fine. I think it is. It's looking at case by case basis, as you say, the risk, how risk adverse the companies are, and the type of business. Where are they? I mean, a lot of producers have been pushed to online. It's sort of retail to get to sort of customers, find new markets. And that's an exposure to a risk in itself in terms of, as you say, cyber sort of security and crime. So it's sort of moving from one market to another opens you up to another issue that might be that you haven't thought of before, but it's how you protect yourself, isn't it? Issues.
That's absolutely right. And over the last 18, 24 months, we've seen an increase in direct consumer business or a bit rather business to business companies going to a business consumer platform, which increased their exposure in different ways.
Yeah, and from the fraud element as well. I know I've spoken to people that have had that issue, and how you manage that. I wonder from Liz's perspective, in terms of some fraud element, you don't want to. It's how you deal with that, isn't it? From a PR perspective, not, I suppose, shining too much light on it. You don't want a journalist to get hold of that story. You want to deliver that information first. And then you can control the narrative.
That's right. I mean, again, as I said, if you can control the message and be very clear about the messages, then that you're sort of you're halfway there, really. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And in terms of the last 18 months, have you seen, from your perspective, Liz, people coming to you actually wanting to? We need a crisis communications plan. We need to update what we're doing, because actually we're seeing we're being tested so much more on every angle at the moment for the business.
Yes, we have. I mean, pandemic wise, as you've seen from some of those case studies, has affected food factories and food producers because of workforce and other crises. Anything to do with humans, anything to do with people tends to create that crisis. So away from the food and drink sector, we've had leisure organisations who perhaps haven't had the right rules in place when people visit those leisure organisations. I'm trying to be really careful about I want to be able to keep some of these anonymised, but we've people that haven't sort of followed the right rules during COVID and have been heavily criticised. And it's for one of the organisations we're doing at the moment, they've been hit not once but twice but 3 times with different crisis and different media who have sort of been alerted to what they are doing or what they're not doing as organisations by members of the public and by staff members. So as I said earlier, everybody is a journalist now. Everybody is, and it's very, very difficult. And it is also very difficult because they often aren't accurate. They're not sort of telling the accurate story. So it is very tempting to take to social media and put people right. But I would really, really dissuade people from doing that.
Yeah. And Hannah, from your perspective, I know you mentioned in terms of keeping the Food Standards Agency close in terms of your sort of the local representatives to help businesses. That's quite interesting, isn't it? And not just in a crisis, is it? You think actually if new businesses are setting up what they're doing, actually it wasn't Food Standards Agency, was it? It was the local enforcement agent from the council, isn't it, to help you actually set up correctly, making sure that you're adhering to all the regulations. So it's that early engagement probably that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if trading standards can see that you are a good, reputable business and you're trying to do the right thing, then they will help you and assist you. I mean, their resources have been cut so much that they don't have a lot of time to go out seeing people all the time. But yeah, if you can get them on board, then I think I would definitely recommend that.
Yeah, early engagement, isn't it? And I think it's that preparing for every event that you can do, isn't it? And making sure that what you're doing is as you should and keeping abreast of regulations. I know you've got a great section on your website in terms of what's happening. We just had Natasha's laws coming in, isn't it, on the 1st of October. So it's just keeping abreast of what's happening, how it affects the business, and how you can sort of navigate with it and make sure that you don't it doesn't form a crisis. But well, thank you so much. I think it's been a really interesting afternoon, a very thought-provoking, I think, as we all sort of navigate the next sort of 6 to 8, sort of 12 months as we come through, or hopefully come through a COVID crisis as well. I'd like to say a very big thank you to our speakers for joining us today. It's really, really fantastic. Definitely food for thought, and very much that prepare, isn't it? And making sure we take the steps before a crisis does strike. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and please do keep in touch, as I'm always keen to hear about the topics that you would like to cover, like us to cover in forthcoming events. Our next event is on the 27th of October, and we'll be focusing on the gifting sector and the opportunities for food and drink producers in this £40 billion sector. Take care and look forward to seeing you next time. Many thanks.